The smell of my grandmother's house was supposed to mean safety. Cinnamon rolls in the oven, cedar from the old closet in the hallway, the faint trace of the lavender sachet my aunt tucked behind every door. I used to love that smell. Standing on the front porch that Saturday in October, suitcase at my feet and a trunk full of wedding gifts for my brother, I breathed it in and told myself it would be different this time. It wasn't. My brother's name is Beckett. He's 31, broad-shouldered, easy to love in the way that some people just are, the kind of person who walks into a room and immediately belongs to it. Growing up, Beckett was the one my parents drove 4 hours to watch play soccer on weekends. He was the one my mother cried about at the dinner table. Happy tears because his coach said he had real potential. I was the one who stayed home and figured out her own rides. I don't say this to make him the villain. Beckett isn't a villain. He's just the sun in my family's solar system, and the rest of us, me especially, learned a long time ago to orbit quietly. His fiancée's name is Priscilla. She's lovely in a very deliberate way, the kind of lovely that takes effort and is not shy about it. She started dating Beckett 3 years ago, and within 6 months, my mother was already calling her the daughter I always wanted. She said it at Easter dinner, right across the table from me. I laughed like it was a joke. I don't think she meant it as one. The wedding was scheduled for the second weekend of October. A vineyard in the Hudson Valley, 80 guests, a florist flown in from Charleston. My parents had been planning it for 14 months. I know because my mother sent me the itinerary once by accident. She'd meant to send it to Priscilla's mother. She apologized immediately. She said, "You weren't supposed to see all the details. We didn't want to overwhelm you." I said that was fine. It wasn't fine. I am 29 years old. I have a master's degree in architecture from Cornell, which I paid for myself through a combination of scholarships, freelance drafting work, and years of eating instant noodles I genuinely cannot look at anymore. I started my own design consultancy at 26, working out of a one-bedroom apartment in Portland, taking every project I could find. Residential renovations, small commercial spaces, a few restaurant interiors that got written up in Pacific Northwest magazine. By the time Beckett announced his engagement, I had 6 full-time employees, a waitlist, and a partnership offer from a mid-size firm in Seattle that I was still deciding whether to accept. My family didn't know any of that. Not because I hid it, I didn't. I had just learned, slowly and then all at once, that when I spoke about my work at family gatherings, eyes glazed. My mother would nod in the particular way that means she is already thinking about something else. My father would ask a polite question, then turn to Beckett and ask about his job in finance, and the conversation would just shift. So I stopped volunteering information. It wasn't a strategy. It was self-preservation. I drove up to my grandmother's house. We were all staying there the night before the ceremony, on a Friday afternoon. The house sits on about 3 acres in Rhinebeck, old stone walls and a wraparound porch that my grandfather built in the 1970s. I have always loved that house in a way that is hard to explain, the way you love a place that holds both good memories and the evidence of what you survived. My mother met me at the door. She looked beautiful, which she always does at important events, silver earrings, a dress the color of sage. She hugged me and said, "You made it?" Like my arriving was slightly unexpected. My father was on the porch with Beckett and 2 of his friends from college. He waved. I waved back. Inside, the house smelled like catered food and anxiety. Priscilla's family had arrived earlier that morning and claimed all 3 of the good guest rooms. I found this out when my mother showed me to the converted sunroom at the back of the house, which had been set up with a cot and a portable fan. "It's just for one night," she said. "Priscilla's cousins drove all the way from Atlanta." "I drove 7 hours," I said. She patted my arm. "You've always been so flexible." I set my bag on the cot and sat down for a minute, listening to the sound of the party assembling in the other rooms. I could hear Priscilla laughing. She has a very distinct laugh, high and bright, like a bell someone is ringing enthusiastically. I could hear my father telling a story. I could hear Beckett. The way I have always been able to hear Beckett, like he is tuned to a frequency the house runs on. I washed my face, changed my shirt, and went to join them. Dinner that night was catered. Italian food, family style, long table set up on the back lawn with string lights overhead. It was genuinely beautiful. I sat at the far end of the table, between a cousin of Priscilla's I'd never met, and an elderly neighbor my grandmother had invited out of kindness. The neighbor, whose name was Herschel, turned out to be wonderful. He'd spent 20 years working as a civil engineer and was genuinely interested in architecture. We talked for most of the meal about load-bearing design and the problems with open-plan renovation in old farmhouses. It was the best conversation I had all weekend. Across the table, my mother and Priscilla's mother were deep in something warm and conspiratorial. Beckett kept catching my eye and grinning, and I grinned back because I do love my brother. I just also happened to be invisible to everyone around him. The wedding itself was on Saturday afternoon, and it was beautiful in a way I could objectively appreciate even while feeling like a coat left hanging in the wrong house. I was not in the wedding party. This had been mentioned once, casually, when Beck had called me 6 months before to say Priscilla wanted to keep the party small, just her sister and 3 college friends as bridesmaids. I said, of course, no problem. Beckett said, "You're still my sister." Like that was clarification I needed. I wore a green dress and sat in the 3rd row. I cried a little during the vows because I am a person and vows are vows. My mother, in the front row, did not look back. The reception was inside a converted barn on the vineyard property, all exposed wood and candlelight. The seating chart put me at table 11. I counted. Beckett and Priscilla were at table 1. My parents were at table 2. Priscilla's aunts, who I had never met, were at table 4. I was between a colleague of Beckett's I had nothing in common with, and an empty seat where someone had apparently canceled last minute. The speeches were long and loving and full of stories about Beckett that I had heard before and stories about Priscilla that I was only now learning for the first time, even though she had been in my family for 3 years. My father gave a speech. He cried. He talked about Beckett's character, his reliability, the kind of man he'd become. He said he was proud in a way words couldn't fully hold. I watched from table 11 and thought about all the times I had wanted my father to look at something I'd built and feel that. Then something unexpected happened. Priscilla's younger sister, Waverly, sat down next to me during the cocktail portion of the evening. She's 25, studying interior design in Philadelphia, and she had apparently been specifically looking for me. "You're the architect," she said. "Priscilla told me to find you." I blinked. "Priscilla mentioned me?" Waverly laughed. "She's been talking about you all year. She said you did the Hartwell restaurant space in Portland." My professor used that as a case study in our materials class. I about died when she said it was her soon-to-be sister-in-law. I looked across the room at Priscilla, who was dancing with Beckett, face lit up. I had spent 3 years assuming she barely registered me, and apparently she had been citing my work in passing conversations with her sister for months. I didn't know what to do with that, so I just answered Waverly's questions. She had good ones. We talked for a long time. At some point, Priscilla's mother drifted over, and then one of Priscilla's aunts, and I found myself in the middle of a conversation about the renovation they were planning for the family's lake house in Vermont. They asked for my card. My parents were about 20 feet away when this happened. I don't know when they noticed, but I looked up at one point and my mother was watching me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not pride, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something surprised. My father came over when Priscilla's relatives eventually moved toward the dance floor. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I didn't know you'd done restaurant work." "I've been doing it for 3 years," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Priscilla's aunt says you have a wait list." 6 months out, I said, sometimes 8. He looked at me the way people look when they're recalculating something they thought they already understood. I recognized the look because I had spent 29 years hoping to see it. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," I said. "You didn't ask." It wasn't cruel. I said it as plainly as I could. He nodded slowly, and I could see him sitting with that, really sitting with it, not deflecting. That was new. My mother found me later, near the end of the night, when the dance floor was full and the candles were burning low. She pulled me gently to a quiet corner near the barn door and held both of my hands, which she almost never does. Waverly showed me some of your projects on her phone, she said. That restaurant space, the homes. She stopped and I could see her working through something. Why didn't you ever show us? I did, I said. A few times. You were always focused on other things. She closed her eyes for a moment. I think, she said slowly, that I told myself you were fine because you always seemed fine. You never needed anything from us after a certain point, and I think I let it become an excuse not to look harder. That is the most honest thing my mother has ever said to me. I'm aware that's a complicated sentence, but it's true. I didn't cry. I thought I would. But I just stood there holding her hands and looking at this woman who has loved me in an insufficient way for most of my life, and I tried to figure out what to do with a moment like this when it finally comes. I would have liked you to look, I said. I know, she squeezed my hands. I'm looking now. I didn't tell her that looking now is a different thing from looking then. I thought it. I held it. But I also thought about how many of my own clients had come to me with buildings they'd neglected. Structures that were still standing, still sound at the core, just in need of someone finally willing to do the work. And how that was not nothing. That was actually something. Beckett found me right before my ride came to take me to the hotel. He hugged me the way he did when we were kids, which is different from his adult hugs, tighter, less self-conscious. He said, I heard you and Priscilla's family got on. She's great, I said. You did good. He pulled back and looked at me, and I recognized the expression because it was the one I'd seen on my father's face. I should have introduced you more, he said. I always assume you're okay. I know. Are you? It was the first time in my adult life that my brother had asked me that directly, standing still, waiting for an actual answer. I'm getting there, I said. I have a good life, Beckett. It would have been nice to share more of it with you. He hugged me again. I let him. The drive to the hotel was quiet. The Hudson Valley was dark and soft-edged out the car window, the kind of darkness that comes before everything turns into color. I thought about the sunroom cot and table 11 and the empty seat next to me at dinner. I thought about Waverly finding me on purpose. I thought about my mother's hands. I've built a career on understanding how space works, how the way a room is designed shapes the way people move through it, relate within it, feel inside it. A bad floor plan creates friction nobody can name. A good one opens something up without anyone realizing why. I've thought for years that my family had a bad floor plan, that I was the room nobody could figure out what to do with. But here's what I know about renovation. You don't tear down a wall without understanding what it's holding up. Sometimes, what looks like neglect is just a failure of attention. And attention, unlike some things, can be given late. That doesn't mean the years don't count. They do. It doesn't mean I'm going to fold myself back into a family shape that cost me so much to outgrow. I won't. But I drove home to Portland 2 days later with something I didn't have when I arrived. Not an apology, exactly, and not a resolution, but a crack in the wall. A little light coming through. I am still deciding what to build with it. I keep thinking about table 11. Not with bitterness. I'm past that mostly, but with a kind of quiet clarity that only comes after enough time and distance. I was seated at the edge of my own brother's wedding. I drove 7 hours, brought gifts, wore a green dress, and was placed between a stranger and an empty chair. And the thing is, nobody in my family did that out of cruelty. They did it out of habit. The habit of not quite seeing me. Of assuming I'd be fine because I always had been. That's the part that took me the longest to understand. Being overlooked is not always an act of malice. Sometimes it's just the accumulated weight of never being asked. And the way I responded to that, quietly, without burning anything down, wasn't weakness. It was a decision I made so many times it became character. I kept building. I kept showing up. Not for their approval, but because the work itself was worth doing, and I knew it even when no one else did. There's something I've learned about integrity that nobody tells you when you're young. It doesn't pay off in the moment. It pays off compounded over years, in ways you can't always see coming. I didn't set out to impress Priscilla's family. I wasn't performing at that reception. I was just talking to Waverly about load-bearing walls and material costs because those things genuinely interest me. The fact that it changed how the room looked at me was a consequence, not a strategy. And that matters, because what's built on performance eventually cracks. What's built on actual substance holds. My father said, "I didn't know." And I said, "You didn't ask." I've replayed that exchange 100 times. I don't regret saying it. It wasn't meant to wound him. It was just true. There's a difference between people who don't care and people who stopped paying attention. And I think my family falls into the second category. That's still a failure. But it's a different kind, and it requires a different response. Not a wall, not a burning bridge, just honesty said plainly, without apology. My mother told me she'd let my self-sufficiency become an excuse not to look harder. That sentence cost her something. I could see it, and I've turned it over since because I think it contains a lesson that goes both ways. For her, and for me. I spent years making myself smaller in that family because it was easier than being dismissed. I stopped sharing my work. I stopped trying to be seen. And in doing that, I gave them permission to forget to look. We were both, in our own ways, not quite doing the hard thing. The hard thing is staying present even when presence is uncomfortable, asking the question even when the answer might hurt, continuing to build even when no one's watching, and then being willing to let people see it when they finally turn around. I am still deciding what I want from my family. I don't think one honest night fixes years of distance. I know it doesn't. But Waverly found me on purpose. My mother held my hands. My brother stood still and asked if I was okay and waited for a real answer. Those are small things. I'm not going to pretend they're everything, but I've built entire rooms out of less promising materials than that, and I know what's possible when someone finally decides to do the work. So do they now, and so do I.